member, Senator Cassidy, for working with me and my team to make this hearing successful. We have a vote today at 2:30, so Senator Cassidy is voting at the top of the hour. He will come back and then he'll take the gavel so I can vote. This is a subcommittee that will focus on how we can create opportunities for every American, how we can build a more equitable economy, and how we can invest in future prosperity. President Biden has proposed a $2 trillion infrastructure package outlining the benefits of investing in roads and bridges and broadband and housing, the things people need to get to work. He's also about to unveil a plan for the caregiving economy, including childcare, universal pre-K, and free community college. Current estimates put the price tag of that package at about $1.5 trillion. All these investments would make the lives of millions of people better, but they carry a total price tag of about $3.5 trillion. So how do we pay for them? Today, we will address that question by talking about revenues, where the money comes from to build a stronger future. There are a variety of proposals that would help us move toward that stronger future, and I'm going to highlight just three that I have put forward. First, a wealth tax would impose an annual 2-cent tax on fortunes bigger than $50 million. It would not raise taxes on 99.9% of Americans by a single penny. That one tax would bring in $3 trillion. Second, the real corporate profits tax would force companies like Amazon and FedEx and Nike that make billions of dollars in profits and pay little or nothing in federal income taxes to pay more. The real corporate profits tax would apply only to corporations that report profits to their shareholders and the public of more than $100 million. These companies would pay 7% of those reported profits, which they use to justify the big salaries and bonuses that they pay their CEOs. And they would pay that no matter how many tax loopholes they find or how many scams they run. President Biden has a similar approach. My approach would raise about $1.3 trillion. And then finally, I have proposed increasing tax enforcement for wealthy individuals and giant corporations. This plan provides mandatory funding for the IRS that is focused on making sure that the rich and powerful get caught when they break the law. Estimates from the commissioner of the IRS indicated that we lose about $1 trillion a year from tax cheating. If we stepped up enforcement to cut the cheating by only 20%, we could raise as much as $1.8 trillion over the next decade. These three big ideas alone would raise more than $6 trillion, enough to pay every single penny of President Biden's American Jobs Plan and pay for every single penny of his American Families Plan and still have more than $2 trillion left over. As these numbers show, our nation can do both. Invest in American families and pay for it without raising taxes on those same families. We can build a country that creates opportunity, not just for those at the top, but creates opportunity for everyone. Now, these big ideas have their critics. In fact, I invited one of the largest critics and loudest critics, billionaire Leon Cooperman, here today to discuss these proposals with the members of the committee and the American public. After all, that's how democracy is supposed to work. Citizens and stakeholders discuss ideas, and then our elected representatives vote. I'm disappointed that Mr. Cooperman decided that he was more comfortable taking softball questions on cable news than subjecting his views to debate in the United States Senate. Now, Mr. Cooperman may have been too frightened to come here today, but others were not. Today, we are joined by a panel of distinguished witnesses, including several academics and tax policy experts, by millionaire Abigail Disney, and by small business owner Cheryl Strotter, who have a variety of views on these proposals and are willing to discuss and debate them in public. A fairer tax system is about making our country better and stronger. It is about allowing us to make investments in our economy by asking the wealthiest Americans and biggest corporations to pay their fair share. So I'm looking forward to this discussion today, and I thank our witnesses and my colleagues for joining us. I would, at this point, ordinarily turn to Ranking Member Senator Cassidy for his opening remarks, but I think he's still voting. As soon as he rejoins us, he can give us those remarks. In the meantime, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our witnesses. First, I am very pleased to introduce Dr. Abigail Disney, who is the CEO and the owner of Fork Films. Next is Ms. Cheryl Strotter, who is the chef and the owner of Soleil Restaurant in Boston, Massachusetts. Next, Mr. David Gamage, professor of law at Indiana University Bloomington's Mayer School of Law. Then, Mr. Scott Hodge, president of the Tax Foundation. Dr. Jeff Hoops, associate professor at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill's Keenan Flagler School of Business. And finally, Mr. Kyle Pomerleau, a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. I want to thank every one of our witnesses for joining us today. And Dr. Disney, I'd like to recognize you for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair Warren and Ranking Member Cassidy, for the opportunity to speak today. When a person's born in this country, it pretty much goes the same way every time. When a baby comes out, gets a little slap on the tushy till he cries and gets handed over to the parent. But in a family like mine, it goes a little bit differently. The baby comes out, gets slapped on the tushy a little bit, and then the doctor looks deep in that baby's eyes and says, never spend capital. It's as close to a religion among people who inherit wealth as anything else. So why is capital so sacred? Well, it's the goose that lays the golden egg. The more capital you have, the more income and growth you can count on, the more stuff you can buy, and so forth. The subtext of never spend capital is, of course, that jobs are for chumps. If you ever find yourself reduced to earning your living by labor, well, then you've surely lost the lottery that you were given when you were born. That's how rich people stay rich. I was born very lucky and continue to be very lucky today. But a lot of things has changed since I was born in 1960, and a lot of it's been very good for me financially. For one thing, Disney stock has soared, in part because of good management and in part because the stock market has soared. So I've owned my way to the top. But there's another thing that's more pertinent for our purposes today, and that is that a lot of what the government has done for the last 40 years has been to shape policy that fight against the natural forces that would normally pull an inheritor like me back down to earth. Things like low corporate taxes and a high tolerance of tax avoidance. Those savings go to executives and to shareholders like me. Companies plowing their skyrocketing profits and tax savings into share buybacks that enrich only, yes, shareholders like me and executives. A growing tax avoidance industry has been growing up that has been advising individuals and families like me about how to minimize their tax obligation in ways both quasi-legal and even potentially criminal. An assault on public spending that included the evisceration of the IRS, the SEC, and all the other regulators that might be more able, if better supported, to restrain some of the trickery. And finally, corporate and individual spending on lobbying and on political campaigns have warped and changed the political processes, rendering some representatives opaque, corrupt, and downright uninterested in the well-being of regular people. When I was born in 1960, the U.S. had a tax system that privileged income from labor over income from wealth. But somewhere along the line, that turned upside down. Now, the more likely a person is to come home with an aching back and sweat on their brow, the more likely I am to be paying a lower effective tax rate than they are. If a tax system is a statement of a country's values, then I really do question ours. The levels of inequality that now characterize American life are historic, and the pandemic has only exacerbated the problem. Wealth among U.S. billionaires has grown by over $1.3 trillion just over the past years. That kind of money would cover a $3,900 stimulus check for every American citizen. The rich may have run amok for the last 50 years of American history, and our government's complicity in their antics has permitted a handful of egregiously wealthy human beings to accumulate massive, budget-warping, mind-blowing amounts of money, all at the continuing expense of all the other Americans. We need to address this inequality by restoring to the working class the benefits that used to come with just being a regular American citizen. But working people will never, by salary alone, be able to catch up with the folks who have succeeded in putting so much distance between themselves and everyone else. Only a wealth tax will get us there. I will go to bat for the wealth tax against any and all businessmen who want to tell you that it impinges on the American dream. If you have $50 million and you can't invest it for more than 2% growth, well, then you have a bigger problem than the wealth tax. And if you have $1 billion and you don't know how to live on $999 million, then you don't need a better tax system, you need a psychiatrist. A tax is not a penalty. A tax is not a theft. A tax is a responsibility. It represents what you owe to society. A tax is the least you can do. It's your patriotic duty. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Disney. And now I call on Ranking Member Cassidy. He's going to give his opening statement. I'm also turning the gavel over to him while I go to vote.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Chairman Wyden, again, Subcommittee Chairman Warren, and Ranking Member Crapo. And I thank my witnesses. I'll be hearing from you. First, let's acknowledge that conservatives and liberals both want what's best for our country. Sometimes we have the spirit of division that suggests that that is not true one for the other. We all wish to have prosperity for those who are doing less well, but as this hearing will show, we have different visions on how to achieve that goal. Conservatives believe in allowing the American people to keep their resources as much as possible to make decisions best for them. Allowing markets to dictate, with safeguards from federal and state government, as to where money should be best allocated, that is what has given us prosperity to date, and I feel, and conservatives feel, more likely to give us prosperity in the future. Now, it's not just we who have seen that, however. We've seen countries which are socialist or communist acknowledge this and evolve towards that path. Whether it's the Czech Republic or China, or countries who have tried wealth taxes like that which we discussed today, Sweden, Austria, Denmark, Germany, Netherlands, Finland, Iceland, Luxembourg, they all have abandoned it. Now, I think it's fair to say, and this committee will show, that the left has a different view. The view is that it's better to take resources from the American people, filter them through the government bureaucracy, allow that bureaucracy to make decisions as to where to spend, and then the American people will more greatly benefit from these government decisions as opposed to those made by private investors. That's really not what's given us prosperity to date. And again, that's what many countries have abandoned. Now, there are those on the left who will object, quote, hold on a second, we're not talking about taxes on anybody but the most wealthy. But this is disingenuous. Disregard that even the revenue from taxing every billionaire in the country at 100% would not come close to funding the programs that have been proposed so far. It's also disingenuous because it presupposes that those whom the left wishes to tax are sitting on a pile of gold like the dragon in Lord of the Rings, not using it in order to invest, in order to create wealth for others, but no, just sitting there. As Dr. Disney said, you got $1 billion. If you can't live on 990 million, then maybe you need to see somebody. But they're not living on 990 million, they're reinvesting that. And I would argue that that wealth is typically not liquid, that it is invested and reinvested, creating jobs and wealth, and the people who do this successfully create more jobs than will the government bureaucrat who would just not, frankly, feel as invested. It's not his money or her money, as opposed to the entrepreneur, it is their money, and they're going to do which brings the best return, and along the way bring return for others. Our first Supreme Court Justice, John Marshall, said, "The power to tax involves the power to destroy." We're not reinventing the wheel here. When you decrease taxes, you encourage investment, jobs follow. When you increase taxes and you increase government control, you destroy investment and job numbers suffer. Now, again, we have some case studies here. Before COVID, Republican-led tax cuts spurred the greatest economy of our lifetime. Record low unemployment for every demographic. The disabled, the high school dropout, for African Americans, for Hispanics, for women, for veterans, you name it. Record low unemployment, record high employment, driven by investment from the private sector. We have wage growth disproportionate in the lower income strata. Now, this may be inconvenient truths for some on the other side of the aisle, but truths nonetheless. We know it works. In fact, let's have a thought experiment. Let's contrast the logical outcome of the two visions of the two sides. Those who would like to raise taxes on the wealthy as kind of a principle would like us to think that the disinterested bureaucrat is able to make a wiser decision as to where to deploy capital than the person whose livelihood depends upon it. In the private sector, if an organization providing a service fails, it's on the dime of the company. Someone else steps up, takes the position to increase productivity, to increase jobs and wages. That's what happens in the private sector, and this is what this hearing is about. But we have a contrasting vision. Think school teachers' unions in Chicago. Children not allowed to be in a class because teachers' unions, against recommendations of the CDC, against science, against their mayor's wishes, still would not reopen. What did they get for that failure of service? They demanded and received billions and billions for union priorities paid for by U.S. tax dollars, which, I guess from this tax, would come from the wealthy who would otherwise use the money to invest in the private sector to increase prosperity. I would argue that the vision of creating jobs for all, as opposed to rewarding the inactivity of some who are politically connected, is part of what underlies this conversation. Now, by the way, rather than talking about whether new taxes are actually needed, we actually will hear how they are justified. Successful individuals use the straw men pitting Americans against each other to build support for a political agenda. Success will be vilified. Undefined goals like fairness will be used as blank checks to justify tax and spend agenda. But what do you tell a family who loses their job because new taxes on the, quote, rich and corporations makes their employer's business model no longer viable? It's okay to lose your job because we really stuck it to the rich. The rich will do fine. The rich are going to do fine. Again, as I said earlier, they will find some way to live on quite a comfortable lifestyle. My fear is the everyday working person caught in the crossfire of tax and spend priorities which destroy the private investment capital and incentive that made their job possible in the first place. By the way, some will say, don't worry, we're going to expand transfer payments. Just in case there is this fallout, we'll have expanded transfer payments. I would argue that this obviously creates government dependency, but I would argue that Americans want independence, not dependence. So I'll just say, I think we're going to hear a fundamental difference between our two parties. Republicans believe that the best stimulus is a paycheck, and a job is better than a transfer payment to support your family. By the way, statistics bear that out as well. I will come close to finishing by saying that a wealth tax is opposed by John Cochran of the Hoover Institute, I guess on the right, to former Treasury Secretary Larry Summers on the left. It's also opposed by the AEI, the Tax Foundation, the Brookings, and the Manhattan Institute have all reported on the negative aspects. So I hope the Biden administration will work with Republicans to get small businesses back on their feet so they can get Americans back to work, earning better wages to keep the economy moving in the right direction. We won't tax our way to prosperity. Small businesses and other employers wish to operate under a fair, predictable tax code. They will do the rest. There are some good things we could be discussing here. Tax relief afforded to the middle class and small businesses through the Tax Cut and Jobs Act expires in just 4 short years. My Republican colleagues and I propose providing predictability to taxpayers by locking in the current individual tax policies on a permanent basis, including the expanded child tax credit and lower tax rates on the middle class. This will help everyday Americans. I look forward to the testimony, and now I call upon Mr. Strotter. You are recognized for 5 minutes.
Hi, are you referencing Ms. Cheryl Strotter?
Yes, if I mispronounced something, I apologize. I didn't have my glasses on.
Okay. All right, here we go. To our distinguished chair and ranking member Cassidy, I want to say thank you for this opportunity. To the members of the committee, I want to thank you all for allowing me to testify. I am not a billionaire or an ultra-millionaire. I am not even close. During my life, there has been times when I worried about my status as a thousandaire. I am a chef and owner of Soleil Restaurant, a small business located in Boston, Massachusetts. I am also a social worker and a member of the Boston Black Hospitality Coalition. I opened my restaurant in 2018 in an area of Boston called Nubian Square. This was a thriving commercial district when I was younger, and I fondly remember shopping with my mother, Shirley, and boarding the elevated train that once operated all the way downtown. Over the years, disinvestment in the community led businesses and families to leave. But when an opportunity arose to take over a vacant space in the neighborhood, I knew that I wanted to be a part of the future of Nubian Square. I'm proud to run this small business. Along the way to my current role, I've been an employee, I have been a student, and a caregiver. I work hard for myself, my family, and my employees, and my community, and I care deeply about all of their well-being. And that's why it's important that we have a fair tax system. I can't say that I enjoy paying taxes, but I am proud to pay them. The revenue collected from our taxes is what we use to pay for government services. We care about schools, healthcare, Social Security. I value those services, and I know they make my community and our nation better. But the unfairness of the current tax system is what drives people crazy. At Soleil, I've got 8 employees that work for me. Their income is reported to the IRS, and they pay their taxes based on that income, including paying a percentage of their income for Social Security and Medicare. But I know the ultra-rich are different. Their income doesn't usually come from a paycheck. It comes from investments and other holdings. That means they often pay less in taxes than my own employees. And I know the ultra-rich have a bunch of ways to hide their income or avoid paying taxes at all. That's unfair. Asking ultra-millionaires and billionaires to pay a small percentage of their massive wealth is a no-brainer. If you have a huge fortune and you benefit from all that this country has provided, you ought to be paying your fair share. It's more than fair that they be asked to pay a small percentage of their wealth. And I just cannot understand why the wealthiest and luckiest people in the world would be complaining about being such a hardship. It's the same with big business that I compete with. They're able to use their resources to lower the amount of taxes that they pay, like hiring expensive lawyers and accountants, or shifting some of their profits overseas. Many Fortune 500 companies don't pay any taxes at all. It's hard enough to compete and run a business during a pandemic. It's nearly impossible to do that when the tax system is rigged against you. Our country has many needs right now. A fairer tax system would give us the opportunity to provide affordable childcare, create a better education system, and repair our roads. We could provide more support to small businesses, especially those owned by African Americans and other groups that do not have easy access to financing, and make housing more affordable. These are important national priorities, and they are also things that I want for my family. I know these investments will make our communities better and stronger and help our economy grow. That would be good for me and for my employees, and good for my customers, and good for my business and businesses all over the country. I am happy to answer any of your questions. Thank you for inviting me to today's hearing, and thank you for all of the work to make our tax system fairer and our nation stronger.
Thank you so much, Ms. Strotter. I appreciate it. Mr. Gamage, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Warren. Thank you, Ranking Member Cassidy, members of the committee, for your invitation to speak with you today. I have been asked to speak on 3 sets of proposals for reforming ways in which our tax system is currently broken. Each of these proposals has the potential for reforming ways in which our tax system is broken by limiting abusive tax gaming by billionaires and mega millionaires and by large corporations. Each of these proposals would help create opportunity for ordinary Americans and small businesses by leveling the playing field. Each of these proposals could help promote shared economic growth by limiting abusive forms of tax gaming that are harmful to the economy and by funding needed public investment. First, the IRS has been starved of funding and resources for over a decade now, which has caused incredible harm to our tax system. The ultra-wealthy and largest businesses can now readily hire tax lawyers, who often charge up to $1,000 an hour to set up complicated structures for avoiding tax. The IRS is simply outgunned in trying to police these abuses. It is common today for ultra-wealthy and largest businesses to wastefully spend millions on tax planning because this saves them tens or hundreds of millions of dollars in tax. Prior Congresses have created this disgrace by hobbling the IRS. I urge this Congress to act quickly to restore adequate funding to the IRS and to the other tax police. And to protect that funding from the whims of the annual appropriations process, and to enact accompanying reforms for promoting tax compliance, like expanding information reporting and extending the False Claims Act to very large tax claims. Second, current law allows large corporations to keep 2 sets of accounting books, one for reporting to the SEC and investors, the other for reporting to the IRS for tax. It is well known that corporations generally inflate the earnings reported on this first set of books to appear more profitable to investors, and in particular to increase managers' stock options. It is also well known that corporations generally underreport earnings on the second set of books through tax gaming to appear less profitable to the IRS so as to pay less tax. Both of these sets of shenanigans are harmful to the economy and to creating a level playing field. To address these problems, the best academic analysis of this issue recommends 50% conformity between tax and accounting books. We currently have 0%. The real corporate profits tax proposal would be an important step in improving this, effectively creating 25% book tax conformity while deterring both tax and accounting shenanigans and raising funds needed for public investment. This would be a meaningful step toward fixing our broken corporate tax system so as to help level the playing field to deter economically harmful tax and accounting shenanigans, all while raising funds needed for public investment. Third, and most importantly, I cannot emphasize enough how our existing income tax is broken as applied to mega millionaires and billionaires and urgently in need of reform. The ordinary rich, like a well-compensated doctor, typically pay quite a lot of income tax. But the progressivity of the income tax falls apart when it comes to billionaires and mega millionaires. The economics literature finds that, on average, billionaires and mega millionaires only ever report less than a quarter of their true income to the IRS, ever. And most of what is eventually reported then qualifies for tax preferences and preferred rates. Estimates of well-known billionaires often find that these billionaires only report around 2% of their true income to the IRS. The income tax is generally progressive with respect to the ordinary rich, but not the ultra-wealthy. If anyone tells you otherwise based on IRS data, remember that the ultra-wealthy never report most of their true income to the IRS. Most of the ultra-wealthy's tax gaming is legal, but very harmful. This tax gaming damages the economy and prevents ordinary Americans and small businesses, especially members of historically disadvantaged groups, from being able to catch up or compete. Fixing the income tax is hard, but urgently needed. One of the best ways to fix the income tax is by taxing extreme wealth holdings of billionaires and megamillionaires directly, as the proposed ultramillionaire wealth tax would do. When it comes to taxpayers of giant fortunes, it is much easier to identify and measure the approximate size of those fortunes than just the income produced by those fortunes. Enacting a tax on extreme wealth holdings would take pressure off the income tax, while providing the IRS with the information on giant fortunes needed to make the income tax and the overall tax system work with respect to the ultra-wealthy. A wealth tax has been a pillar of the Swiss tax system for over 100 years and provides substantial revenues for Switzerland. The Swiss model shows how we can design an effective and administrable tax on extreme wealth. Plus, recent innovations in information technology and financial reporting make it much easier to design an administrable and effective wealth tax than it was in the past. Giant fortunes benefit from the protections and services provided by the state, including the military and police and the legal system. Billionaires and megamillionaires should not be permitted to pay a lower share of tax on their true incomes than do ordinary working class Americans, as is currently generally the case. All three sets of reforms I've spoken on today would help fix broken parts of our tax system, would help level the playing field for ordinary Americans and small businesses and members of historically disadvantaged groups, and would promote shared economic growth by deterring economically harmful tax gaming and providing the funds needed for public investment. I strongly support all three sets of proposals, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gamage. Mr. Hodge, you are now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. You know, a famous economist once said, there are no solutions, there are only trade-offs. And that lesson is especially true in tax policy and in the choices that lawmakers must make in funding public investment. The scales of justice may have 2 trays, but tax policy has 3 trays: revenues, equity, and economic growth. But those factors cannot be balanced equally, so lawmakers must decide which is most important. Empirical evidence tells us that there is a clear trade-off between progressivity and economic growth. And this is especially true with so-called success taxes, like taxes on capital and business income. Understanding these dynamics matter in how you fund government investments. Research by the Congressional Budget Office tells us that government investments deliver only half of the economic returns of private sector investments. Private sector investments, according to CBO, return 10% on the dollar, whereas government investments return just 5%. So considering the opportunity costs that come with government spending, lawmakers must be careful in choosing offsets that don't do more harm to the economy than the modest benefits generated by those public investments. Indeed, the U.S. tax system is already one of the most progressive in tax and redistributive systems in any industrialized country. So making the tax code even more progressive through proposals such as the wealth tax, a minimum tax on book income, or an increase in the corporate tax rate are among the most economically damaging options that could be used to fund government programs. For example, the Tax Foundation, our general equilibrium model, found that Senator Warren's wealth tax could raise over $2 trillion over a decade, but at a very high economic cost. The model found that the wealth tax's hit to GDP was greater than the effect of raising the corporate tax rate to 28% and 4 times greater than the economic effect of a $25 per ton carbon tax. More importantly, the model determined that the tax would result in a shift in the ownership of U.S. assets as wealthy taxpayers sold off their assets to pay the tax. But because the U.S. is an open economy, the model shows that foreign investors would come in, buy up those assets at a discount. So what the wealth tax would do is lead to a transfer of wealth from rich Americans to rich foreigners, which would put those assets out of reach of the wealth tax. Similarly, our modeling of the minimum book tax found that it would reduce the size of the economy by 1.9%, lower the capital stock by over 3%, trim wages by 1.5%, and cost the economy over 450,000 jobs. And while those at the top of the income scale would see the largest declines in after-tax incomes, taxpayers in every income group would see their incomes fall as a result. The economic effects of President Biden's book tax proposal are not quite as severe as Senator Warren's, but the biggest effect of both is the complexity they add to the tax code and the fact that they outsource key aspects of the tax system to the unelected decision makers at the Financial Accounting Standards Board. Turning now to the issue of raising the corporate income tax. Economists at the OECD determined that the corporate income tax is the most harmful tax for economic growth because capital is the most mobile factor in the economy and thus the most sensitive to high tax rates. But an even more important factor to consider is that academic research is finding that workers are bearing a greater share of the economic burden of the corporate tax through lower wages because capital is mobile and workers are not. A recent study found that workers bear 51% of the economic burden of the corporate tax through lower wages, with women, low-skilled workers, and younger workers impacted the most. These are the workers who've been most hurt by the COVID recession and the ones whose incomes were rising most before the COVID hit. Well, in closing, it kind of may be a little bit of cliche, but there is no such thing as a free lunch in government spending or in tax policy. Inevitably, progressive tax policies will slow the economy and reduce the living standards of the very people that the new government investments are intended to help, leaving taxpayers and the economy worse off. Thank you very much, Chair, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hodge. Dr. Hoops, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Warren. Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, and distinguished members. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this hearing today. My testimony today will focus on perceptions of fairness in the tax code and proposals to fix them, specifically a tax on book income and the wealth tax. My main message is that corporations and individuals often remit the taxes they do, including in situations some perceive as unfair, generally because of explicit allowances in the tax code. We should revise the tax code in ways that make it simpler, rather than layer on other provisions that will make it more complicated, costlier to administer, and have negative consequence. Taxing the book income and a wealth tax are 2 examples of such inadvisable taxes. Perceptions of unfairness in corporate tax payments sometimes occur when corporations are seen reporting different incomes to their shareholders than to the IRS. These perceptions ignore the purpose of the different accounting systems corporations are subject to. In general, when tax and book numbers are not aligned, it is because Congress has made the law such that the 2 numbers are different. Let me provide 3 examples based on public IRS data from 2017. In 2017, the difference between book income and taxable income as a result of depreciation, the allowance for net operating losses, and the general business tax credit, which includes the R&D tax credit, accounted for $138 billion in lost tax revenue. Considering that total corporate tax receipts are $388 billion, the $138 billion is economically very large. This lost revenue is the result of explicit allowances in the Internal Revenue Code made by Congress and not aggressive tax planning by firms. All 3 of these items are generally accepted by tax experts as acceptable, are tax provisions shared by many other countries, and research suggests that they are useful in accomplishing the goals for which Congress enacted them. Let's compare those 3 items to estimates for the cost of corporate income shifting, one of the more common forms of tax planning. One estimate of income shifting suggests that between 4 and 8% of tax revenue are lost to profit shifting, which in 2017 would amount to between 16 and 31 billion. The most extreme estimate is that 100 billion was lost in 2017. Similarly, the most recent estimates from the losses due to illegal income tax evasion by all corporations from the IRS suggest losses of about 32 billion. There's reason to believe that in a post-tax reform world, these estimates are overstated. Even so, they are still only a fraction of the cost of just the 3 tax provisions I mentioned above. Owing to the perception that corporations don't pay a fair amount of tax, there are proposals to tax financial accounting or book income. We should not tax book income. First, including book income in the tax base would distort book income and make stock markets less efficient, as companies would manage their earnings to pay less in tax. Evidence from a 1986 tax change suggests this previously happened, and we have reason to believe it would happen again if we again tax book income. Second, taxing book income would politicize the Financial Accounting Standards Board, the creators of US GAAP, making earnings less reliable. Taxing book income is a band-aid solution that would create more problems than it solves. There's also a common perception that wealthy people do not pay a sufficient amount in tax. One proposed solution for this problem is a wealth tax. Wealth taxes rely on the wealthy disclosing and valuing their assets annually. Recent research by Guyton et al. 2021 finds that some of the wealthy are very adept at hiding their assets from even the most thorough IRS audits, suggesting uncovering these assets would be costly. I'd expect much more of this type of asset concealment if a wealth tax were implemented. Further, once uncovered, valuing these assets would also be very costly. Private companies, art, and the like can be very difficult to value. The cost of administration and enforcement of a wealth tax would not justify the revenue a wealth tax could raise. These costs are one reason why a dozen EU countries have tried the wealth tax, and few of these taxes persist. My main message is that many of the ways in which large corporations and wealthy taxpayers remit taxes at a level the general public may perceive as unfair are frequently legal methods intentionally legislated by Congress. Certainly some illegal tax evasion occurs. Congress should take action to stem this evasion, including by increasing funding to the IRS. But the best estimates of this evasion suggest that the dollars at stake are much less than the explicitly legal means taxpayers take to reduce their tax liabilities. Members of Congress perceive the tax system as unfair and seek to raise additional revenue in order to expand the size and scope of government. They should fix whatever provisions they deem unfair and not implement additional taxes that are difficult and costly to administer and would have adverse consequences. I look forward to answering your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hoops. And finally, Mr. Pomerleau, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chair Warren, Ranking Member Cassidy, thank you for the opportunity to speak today. In my testimony, I will briefly discuss two policies under consideration. The first, taxing the book income of corporations, and the second, an annual tax on wealth. I will then conclude by discussing alternative sources of revenue that I think lawmakers should at least consider. There are currently two proposals to tax book income of corporations, and I think that they're distinct. First is President Biden's proposal for a 15% minimum tax on book income. And the second is Senator Warren's proposal for a 7% add-on book income tax that would be paid each year. Both of these proposals are driven by a perception that profitable corporations that report low or no tax liability are engaged in aggressive tax avoidance. No doubt corporations try to minimize their tax liability, but as been argued already, taxing book income would not necessarily address tax avoidance. Low effective tax rates relative to book income are often driven by differences in how book and taxable income are calculated. And what are called these book tax gaps arise from differences in how book and taxable income deals with things like capital expenses, executive compensation, the treatment of losses, and the treatment of foreign income earned by U.S. multinational corporations. And rather than addressing tax avoidance, taxing book income may result in corporations adjusting book income to avoid taxation, which could reduce the informational quality of book income. And at the same time, taxing book income may undermine Congress's own policy goals in other places. Congress frequently uses the federal income tax to encourage or discourage certain behaviors. For example, Congress has limited the deductibility of executive compensation since the 1990s. However, for book tax purposes, executive compensation would be fully deductible, which would reverse some of that policy change that Congress deemed appropriate. And lastly, for the book tax, it would also likely influence investment incentives. Now, these incentives will depend greatly on the structure of the tax, whether it's a minimum tax or a parallel tax. But one of the biggest changes it would make is with the treatment of accelerated depreciation and expensing, which are important parts of the corporate tax base that limit the distortion of the corporate tax on the domestic economy. In addition to the book tax, some lawmakers are also proposing an annual tax on the wealth of very high net worth households. While some argue an annual wealth tax is a modest tax, it actually would place a significant burden on savings. For an example here, an annual wealth tax, even what seems to be a low rate, say 2%, would reduce the return of an asset that that earns a return of 3% by 67%. In other words, it would be equivalent to a 67% income tax. And as Mr. Hodge mentioned, this would have an impact on the broader economy. Reducing the after-tax return on savings would reduce the stock of national savings, could lead to a smaller capital stock, lower wages for workers and economic output, and due to the openness of the U.S. economy, it would result in an inflow of foreign capital from abroad, an increase in the trade deficit in the short term, and a reduction in national income. In addition, the revenue potential of the wealth tax is somewhat uncertain and often overstated. For example, there's little agreement over how much wealth is even held by the very top. Research has estimated that the share of wealth held by the top 0.1% could be anywhere between 10% of all wealth or 20% of all wealth. And one thing that concerns me about the wealth tax is that it risks not raising any revenue whatsoever. And this is because a wealth tax, if enacted, would likely face a constitutional challenge. And while some have argued that the wealth tax is constitutional, it's worth emphasizing that other taxes wouldn't even face this question at all. Now, given the challenges with taxing wealth and book income, I think lawmakers should consider other sources of revenue that would be simpler to administer and more economically efficient. Raising the gas tax or enacting a vehicle miles travel tax would be a reasonable way to pay for infrastructure. A carbon tax would help address climate change while raising revenue. And a value-added tax would be a broad-based tax that could raise a lot of revenue with limited negative impact on the economy. And in addition to funding more spending, these taxes could also be used to offset more distortionary taxes. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pomerleau. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Our tax system is broken. Everywhere you look, there is one set of rules for most Americans and a different set of rules for the richest people. One of the most glaring examples of this is how the tax code treats wealth. The typical white family has about $188,000 in wealth. For Black and brown Americans, that number is far lower, just $36,000 for Latino families and $24,000 for Black families. So let's just focus for a minute on what wealth looks like at the top. Let me start here. Dr. Disney, if you don't mind my asking, how much wealth do you have and how much did it grow last year?
I have about $120 million, maybe more, depending on how the stock market is on any given day. It grows at about 4 to 8% annually.
Okay, thank you. And so let's just say, you said 4 to 8%, let's just say an average growth of about 6%. That would mean that your wealth grew by about $7 million last year. That is almost 60 times the total wealth of the typical American family. So let's just for a minute talk about that increase. Do you know how much in taxes you will pay on your $7 million increase in wealth this year, Dr. Disney?
Not that much. It comes not from wages, but from things like dividends and capital gains and interest and so forth. So all of that qualifies for a lower tax rate than income.
All right. And what about your total $120 million fortune? How much do you think you'll pay in taxes on that this year?
Nothing. There's no wealth tax, so
Why
it will never
not?
be taxed.
Yeah. So thank you. As I'm sure you know, your situation is not unique. In fact, 99% of Americans pay about 7.2% of their wealth in total taxes every year, but the top 0.1%, they only pay about 3.2%. The unfairness runs deep. Home ownership is the #1 way that most middle-class Americans build wealth, and those Americans pay property taxes every single year on that wealth. But if you are an ultra-millionaire or a billionaire, you have a million different kinds of assets: stock, paintings, diamonds, gold, cash, and you get to hang on to all of those assets as they appreciate without paying taxes. And if you decide to sell, You'll have an army of lawyers and an endless supply of carefully crafted tax loopholes to help you avoid paying taxes. Now, I've proposed a tax on the wealth of the very richest Americans. This is a 2-cent tax on every dollar of wealth above $50 million and a few cents more on every dollar above $1 billion. It would raise $3 trillion in revenue that we could use to build economic opportunity for every person in America, from universal child care to investments in education to fixing our roads and bridges. The tax would be paid by the wealthiest 100,000 families, including yours, Dr. Disney. Poll after poll shows that Republicans, Democrats, and independents support this idea. Now, not everybody loves it. Leon Cooperman, a hedge fund billionaire who was hauled up before the SEC for boosting his fortune by using illegal insider trading, is one critic. He has described my 2-cent wealth tax as dumping on the American dream. I invited him here to make his case to Congress today, but I guess he prefers to stay in the safe space of financial news networks where he can say whatever he wants and nobody pushes back. Dr. Disney, you agreed to appear today, so let me ask you. If my wealth tax was the law, you'd own nearly $1.5 million on your fortune. Of course, you'd still be fabulously wealthy, and your wealth, which you said grew by about $7 million last year, would still have grown, but only by about $5.5 million. So let me ask, do you agree with Mr. Cooperman that this increase in your taxes would be, and I'm paraphrasing the word he used, dumping on the American dream?
Well, my American dream would be alive and well, because the only effect a wealth tax would have on me would be to slow the growth of my wealth. It won't be taking anything from me that I need. And my American dream also includes a lot of the people who aren't currently having the benefit of things like roads and schools and parks and good health care and so forth. So to me, it's part of the American dream to step up and pay my fair share.
Thank you. And Ms. Strotter, if I can, let me ask you, a wealth tax would allow us to invest in the health and well-being of your workers. It would help us repair roads so it's easier to get to work. It would help level the playing field for small businesses like yours. How would that affect your ability to pursue the American dream?
Yeah, using the voice of small business, it would allow me to increase my staff. It would allow me to grow from a small-sized business to a medium-sized business. It would allow me to pivot. So right now I'm in the headquarters of the Boston School Department, and right now many of the employees are working from home. So I'm trying to increase my capacity as a caterer. So what would help is the ability to have my business positioned to go after more contract work.
Thank you. That's very helpful. President Biden has called for raising taxes on the wealthy and on giant corporations to fund his Build Back Better agenda, and I agree. A wealth tax raises more revenue from those most able to afford it than just about any other plan on the table. It would allow us to build back better and to make the American dream a reality for millions of families. I now recognize Senator Cassidy for his questions, and once again, I'm going to hand him the gavel while I go vote, and I'll be back.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Hodge, again, I didn't have my glasses on, so now I can't read my own writing. Was it you that said that...
Borrow mine.
What's that? Thank you, yeah. 1.75, anyway. Was it you that said that private investment will give you about a 10% return and government investment about 5%, and that is the opportunity cost of having it filter through the government?
Exactly. Actually, that's the Congressional Budget Office in a very in-depth report and analysis of the returns to infrastructure spending found that data, that government investments return about half the returns of private sector investments for a variety of reasons.
Okay, just hold that, just hold that.
Yeah.
So, Ms. Strotter mentioned how she feels as if the investment that may come through what is being called the infrastructure package or something such as that may help her business grow. But what I'm hearing is that if that is an economically viable project, and if you were to do the same thing through the private sector, you would have more bang for your buck, less friction costs, and that you may either have more investment or investment not just there, but someplace else. Is that the logical conclusion from the CBO study?
That's exactly right. And what they did not take into account is the harm to the economy of taxing those dollars in the first place in order to pay for the investment. So there are really two hits to the economy. One is the opportunity costs of a lower investment through government. The other is through the economic harm through the taxes that are raised in order to pay for it.
Yeah, I do find that government tends to take care of itself. I know Ms. Strotter is in a building where all the teachers have been teaching remotely. I suspect if you went to a private or parochial school, well, maybe not. Maybe Boston's locked down everybody. But if we go to Chicago, we know that some schools have been open, some have not, and the government employees are the ones who've not. I say that as a government employee. There is a certain investment that you make. Mr. Gamage, Dr. Gamage, I'm sorry, I apologize. Let me find my question here. I've been told that since 1990, at least 9 European countries with a wealth tax have abandoned it, leaving only 3 that retain a wealth tax. What are your thoughts about that, and why should that inspire confidence in the ability to administer such?
Thank you, Mr. Cassidy. With respect, it's Gamage, not Gamage.
I'm sorry, Gamage?
Yes, Gamage. Thank you.
I'm from Louisiana, so I'm going to put a little bit of a French inflection upon it. I'm sorry.
Totally understood. So the countries that so-called abandoned wealth taxes, mostly that was during the Reagan-Thatcher era, where countries across the world were abandoning all sorts of progressive taxes based on flawed economic analysis that hasn't held up. Countries haven't abandoned the wealth tax for the most part recently. It's very effective and has been for over 100 years.
But don't I know that in France they abandoned it? That was after, I mean, I don't think of France as being under the sway of Reagan and Thatcher, but indeed it was after the Reagan-Thatcher movement that they first attempted to place, and then they abandoned?
Yes, there's 2 issues with that. One, the French wealth tax was poorly designed. Some other wealth taxes were poorly designed and should have been abandoned because of poor designs. 2, it used to be quite easy for very wealthy individuals and families to hide wealth and income abroad. Since 2010, with the implement of FATCA, increased information technology, and other financial reporting innovations, this is now very difficult. And both income taxes with respect to wealth supposedly moved abroad, but also wealth taxes worked much, much better than they did.
So let me ask you that, because we were recently told from various people across from the IRS director, et cetera, that there's a tax gap, that there are dollars out there that need to be taxed, but they're being hidden. I think in your testimony, I heard that you recommend, or maybe it's this bill, $70 billion that would go towards improving IRS enforcement, data collection, et cetera. So that suggests to me that maybe the ability to gather the data isn't as robust as your last statement seems to suggest. Am I just not connecting the dots correctly?
With respect, I'd say you're not. It's true that there is a tax gap which measures tax evasion. The tax gap is much larger for the ultra-wealthy than it is for ordinary Americans. But the tax gap is teeny compared to legal tax avoidance.
No, that's my point. My point is that if these figures are so readily ascertained, oh, we can figure them out, don't worry about it, and these collection systems are so efficient that the wealth tax would now work where formerly it could not, then how are people able to evade, and why do we need to give the IRS so much more money?
People have limited, although significant, ability to evade. They have substantial ability to avoid legally the income tax, because the income tax by law only collects tax if salaries are paid, stock or financial assets
But
are
that seems
sold
to
or
suggest to
dividends
me,
are collected.
it seems like you're talking about two different things. One is the legal avoidance, and the other is the evasion. And when you told me that the income tax, the wealth tax in France didn't work because people could too easily hide income, evade, and now they can't. But nonetheless, I'm hearing other testimony that suggests that there's still substantial evasion, therefore we have to invest this money in the IRS. There actually seems to be a disconnect between these two sets of statements. Maybe I should just move on because I'm not sure that seem like we're talking past each other, but I do think my question's a valid one. Mr. Hodge, what's your perspective? Going to the other side, why did European nations abandon the wealth tax?
Well, there are three primary reasons. One is the complexity that's already been discussed and the very difficult administrable aspects of it. The other one, it raised very little revenues. In fact, Switzerland is often held up as the paragon of a successful wealth tax that's been there for more than a century, but it raises less than 4% of all tax revenues in Switzerland, so it's basically a trivial impact on their fisc. And then lastly is the avoidance issue and the fact that people can move. And this is what drove France to eliminate their wealth taxes, because the wealthy in France were fleeing, and they decided that they could live quite nicely elsewhere and not pay the tax.
Mr. Gamage, then with that statement, do you favor a worldwide wealth tax? Because that doesn't seem practical to me, but that seems to be if people can move, and they do, and if capital can move, and it does, it seems as if the one example, for example, I understand that China has an incredible capital flight, and if there's any country that's done its best to surveil everything about every one of its citizens, it's China, and yet they have significant capital flight. So would you recommend a global wealth tax?
The United States tax system, the current income tax, is citizenship-based and taxes all worldwide income for citizens and always has. This is a key difference between this US tax system and the French tax system. You can't escape the US tax system without revoking your citizenship and paying a substantial exit tax. That's current law, and it works quite well.
And so the idea that somebody would give up their citizenship, I think one of the partners that made a lot of money from selling, or some big Silicon Valley going public, renounced his citizenship and moved to Singapore, if I remember correctly. I'm gathering from you feel as if that problem would be minimal.
It historically has been minimal, and you pay
now,
a
historically,
big
we
exit
haven't had a
tax to
wealth
do it.
tax. And so I'm not sure we can use past history to predict future actions, to kind of paraphrase the financial commercial.
Again, you pay a substantial exit tax under current law by revoking citizenship. Not many people do it, some do. If they don't value the protections and services provided to citizens of the United States, then fine. But the protections and services provided to extreme wealth are huge. And most ultra wealthy benefit tremendously from being United States citizens and having those protections and services. And it's fair to have them pay a reasonable amount of tax on that, which they currently are not.
Okay. Mr. Pomerleau, just to kind of spread out the questions, there seems to be a lot of, if you will, verbal sleight of hand in that people are conflating wealth and income. Now, we know people get that confused. Warren Buffett used to say that he paid more in taxes than his secretary, but I think at that time he was the richest or second richest person in the world. Excuse me. I got to take a quick recess. They just passed me a vote note. I have to go vote very quickly, but Senator Warren will be right back, and then we will resume. Quick recess, probably just minutes. You sure this is true?
We're back in session. Apologize for the delay, but that's what happens when we have to vote. So, our rigged tax code allows big corporations to report enormous profits to their shareholders and at the same moment report little or no profits to the IRS. Of course, when giant corporations don't pay taxes on their profits, somebody has to pay, and the tax burden falls mostly on working families. That's why I've proposed a real corporate profits tax to force the biggest and the most profitable corporations to pay their taxes. For every dollar in profits over $100 million that a corporation reports to their investors, they have to pay 7 cents to the IRS. No tricks, no deductions, no loopholes, nothing fancy. President Biden has proposed something similar. One of our witnesses today is Abigail Disney, a shareholder in the Disney company. So let's talk about how companies like Disney use the current tax system. Dr. Disney, one scheme that Disney uses to pay less in taxes is to write off stock options that it awards its executives at a higher value than they report on their financial statements. So how much has Disney benefited from deducting stock options?
Disney's been able to save about $1 billion from 2008 to 2015 just by this one bit of trickery alone.
Wow. $1 billion loophole that doesn't require the company to do anything differently, just file some paperwork. So thank you.
Right.
Ms. Strotter, you own a business. What about you? How much in stock options have you deducted on your tax returns in recent years?
Pardon the smile, 0. You know, we talked about a few words here today, and I have not been able to do that.
Okay, so let's do another example. Multinational corporations are able to use accounting maneuvers that shift money they've earned in the United States to lower taxed countries, which artificially lowers their U.S. profits. Dr. Disney, how much has Disney benefited from these profit-shifting schemes?
Well, I do know that in the year 2013, they were able to save about $315 million, $315 million on their tax bill.
Okay, and Ms. Strotter, how much of your business's income did you shift to a subsidiary in a lower tax country?
I did not do that at all.
Yeah. Now, many companies also lobby Congress for specific tax breaks. In other words, these companies write the tax rules that apply to them. Dr. Disney, has Disney been lobbying members of Congress for any special tax credits?
Disney spends a lot of time lobbying Congress as well as local governments and anyone else who has a say in what they pay in taxes.
Okay, and Ms. Strotter, how many high-paid lobbyists are walking the halls of Congress to find tax breaks that will benefit you personally?
I have not met one yet.
You know, this is the problem. Our tax code is rigged in favor of giant corporations like Disney, and everyone else, people like Ms. Strotter, are paying for it. Disney isn't alone. In recent years, dozens of profitable companies have gotten away without paying 1 cent in federal income taxes for the entire year. Companies like Amazon, Nike, FedEx, Chevron, Netflix, Eli Lilly, Starbucks, IBM, HP, Halliburton. So, Professor Gamage, we've gone through a couple of ways, just a couple, that big corporations use their massive resources to rig the tax system. Would a tax on book income, like my real corporate profits tax, ensure that these giant companies can't get away with paying nothing in taxes?
Yes, absolutely, Chair Warren. Because corporations can keep 2 books, they can currently report high earnings to investors and to increase stock options for management, while reporting low earnings or no earnings to the IRS through tax shenanigans. The real corporate profits tax would limit both of these sets of accounting games. To briefly give just one more example, as I believe all three of the Republican invited witnesses noted, the tax books allow accelerated depreciation and full expensing, which could in theory be part of a good corporate tax system. The problem is it only works if you combine it with very strict limits on interest expense deductions, which we currently don't have. When you have generous interest expense deduction limits and these other provisions, as we currently do, it's not all that difficult for high-priced tax lawyers like my friends and former students in practice to design wasteful, complicated transactions, earning enormous fees to reduce tax payments on the corporate side without affecting reported earnings. The real corporate profits tax would deter all of these financial tax accounting shenanigans to the benefit of the real economy and creating a level playing field.
Well, thank you, Professor Gamage. You know, this is why the President's Made in America plan is so important. It includes no-brainer policies like raising the corporate tax rate and cracking down on overseas profit shifting. But it also contains a backstop similar to my real corporate profits tax. As President Biden has said, we have firemen and teachers paying 22%, while these giant companies pay nothing. That is wrong. Yes, that is wrong, and Congress can change it. With that, I recognize Senator Carper for 5 minutes.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Thank you for inviting me to join you all today. And to our witnesses, we've got a number of hearings that are going on and some important votes on the floor. So don't take the fact that we're not all here at once the wrong way. We're delighted that you've joined us today virtually in reality, and grateful to the chair for bringing us together. Madam Chair, long before I was a senator or governor, I was a House member, and I used to hold town hall meetings, lots of them, hundreds of them. I love town hall meetings. And one of the things I would do every year, we would do sort of like a budget workshop in a town hall meeting, and we would invite people to spend a couple of hours, just ordinary citizens, helping us balance the budget. And at the time, the deficit was like closer to $100 billion than to $1 trillion. But I remember this one, and usually we're actually able to make progress and find common ground and balance the budget in a 2-hour episode. I said, well, we ought to elect you guys and bring you down to Washington. But I remember this part, in one particular meeting we're having with all these citizens for this workshop. I remember saying to the group that was there that part of balancing budgets is making sure we have ample revenues. I think I quoted Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said that taxes are what we pay for a civilized society. And but anyway, I remember this one lady at the room. She said, "You know, I don't mind paying taxes. I just want to make sure that other people are paying their fair share of taxes." I've never forgotten that. I've never forgotten that. And Madam Chair, you know, it was about a week or so ago we had the Commissioner of the IRS here, Chuck Ruddick, and in past years, the previous Commissioner, John Koskinen, who's a terrific public servant. And among the things we talked about are what could we do as an oversight committee over the IRS, what could we do to better ensure that the IRS has the resources, one, for providing a guidance and advice to taxpayers so they can know how to complete their taxes, and two, to make sure that everybody, going back to the lady's comments years ago in a budget workshop, just to make sure that everybody's paying taxes. And for the almost, I think, 10 years that John Koskinen was the commissioner of the IRS, he would come before this committee in this room and ask for additional revenues for the IRS so that he could hire some additional people and to hire the kind of people, the skills that they needed, and to provide the technology that would enable them to make sure that everybody's better ensure that everybody's paying their fair share. And his testimony, very sadly, fell on deaf ears, year after year after year. And over in the House of Representatives, the Republicans in the House sought to impeach him, just rake him over, not just rake him over the coals, but to literally throw the book at him. And that did not succeed. He's finished up his tour, and he's now, I think, still gainfully, maybe not employed, but he's working, still working and contributing. But I remember he used to tell us for every dollar that we would provide for the IRS, they could collect anywhere between $5 to $10. That's pretty good return on investment. And he would say the same thing about hiring people and providing the technology that was needed. And the subsequent, he retired, and our new commissioner, Mr. Reddick, has testified just in the last month in this same room. And he said very much the very same thing that Commissioner Koskinen said. We need resources. We need resources. We need people. We need technology to help us better advise people, help people to complete their returns and file their taxes, pay their taxes. But we also need, for some of the folks some of the businesses have very, very complex finances. We just need to have the wherewithal to dig down on those, drill down on those, and make sure that they're paying their fair share as well. So I've on reforming the estate tax and step up in basis. I like to treat other people the way I'd want to be treated, and I'm sure that all of us feel that way. But when I think it was a House member years ago, I believe that there was an exclusion for the estate tax. I want to say it was about $1 million, maybe for a couple. And today, if I'm not mistaken, it's about 20 times that. And I thought maybe arguably $1 million was too low. I think just as arguably, given the size of the deficits we face, $20 million is too high. And there's probably a reporter asked me today how I felt about reforming the estate tax, and I said I think there's probably a number between 1 and 20 that actually would probably help us on the budget side, but also just try to be fair to folks who are filing their taxes. So I'm interested. This is something I'm interested in, and I'm delighted that you're holding this hearing. I have maybe, let's see if I have a question. This is Professor, and I'm going to butcher his name, but it's spelled like Gamage, Gamage. How does he pronounce it?
Gamage, please.
Gamage, like damage. It rhymes with damage.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Professor Gamage, not damage, but thank you. Where are you joining us from today, sir?
Indiana University, Bauer School of Law, currently in my home in Bloomington.
Okay. We have just confirmed an Indianan to be Deputy Administrator for EPA. And her name is Janet McCabe, and she was confirmed on a bipartisan vote, and we're delighted with that. Good woman. Mr. Gamage, thanks to, again, our thanks to Senator Warren for pulling us together. And I mentioned the earlier testimony of John Koskinen and Chuck Reddick, current commissioner. And I'm not going to repeat that again, but I would ask this question. Can you share your thoughts on how we can best equip the IRS to close the tax gap? This is a question I've asked repeatedly of the previous commissioner and current commissioner, but your thoughts on how we can best equip the IRS to close the tax gap, and what will greater enforcement mean for broader fairness in our tax code? Mr. Gamage, please.
Thank you, Senator. The tax gap, illegal tax evasion, is a real problem and should be policed better, I'll say, as I'll explain. Looking back to Senator Cassidy's questions to me earlier, it is important to understand that illegal tax evasion is small compared to legal tax avoidance enabled by loopholes in the current system. But illegal tax evasion is, if anything, especially harmful, both because of the small but significant direct revenue loss, but also to harm to tax morale, compliance norms, and faith in the overall economic and political system. The academic literature is clear that first, the most important thing to do is fund the IRS adequately and protect that funding from the whims of the annual appropriations process. The committee is considering some important measures to do that. On top of that, improving information reporting would be the next most critical step. On top of that, I would strongly recommend extending the Federal False Claims Act to large tax claims of ultra-wealthy families and individuals and the largest businesses, like New York State does, as an important backstop to the IRS's tax enforcement mechanisms. Again, tax evasion isn't the biggest portion of the problem. It's small in revenues compared to illegal or compared to fully legal tax avoidance. But it's important both in its own right for the revenues and perhaps even more importantly for the impact on faith in the tax system and overall tax morale. We need to fund the tax police and give them better tools to do their jobs. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I have a couple of other questions for the record, including one for Dr. Disney regarding taxation, generational inheritance, and helping to create a fair, more fiscally responsible tax system with respect to the estate tax. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Senator Carper. The chair now recognizes Senator Wyden.
Thank you very much, Chair Warren, and I think it is extraordinarily important that you are addressing income inequality through the tax code, and I want to pick up on some of the issues that have been discussed today apropos of this question of the IRS and tax enforcement. We were told, of course, in the committee that the tax gap was much bigger than anyone had anticipated. And today we got additional information that drives this particular assessment. I asked the Justice Department to get us information about whether Credit Suisse continued to help wealthy Americans defraud the Internal Revenue Service even after it signed a settlement agreement to stop the practice. So every time you turn around, we do see issues relating to whether or not affluent Americans, the fortunate few, can take advantage of an undermanned, outgunned Internal Revenue Service, their words, not mine. And Professor Gamage, your points here are well taken, and we expect the Justice Department to give us that information promptly because there are some issues with respect to Credit Suisse that are very timely. So I think what I'd like to do is turn to two other issues that drive income inequality in the tax code. And Mr. Professor Gamage, get your assessment on this. The first is the effect that the loopholes have in the tax code. I mean, it seems to me that wealthy taxpayers have found ways to largely avoid estate and gift taxes through complex shelters and trusts and the like. And large corporations have found ways to shrink their tax liabilities also through complicated schemes. Tell us, if you would, how that contributes to this issue of driving income inequality in the tax code.
Yes, thank you, sir. And I would be remiss if I didn't note that the work you and your staff are doing on mark-to-market reforms to income tax, I think, are one of the most exciting developments in tax reform since I've been a tax professor, but maybe for our nation's history.
Thank you.
To answer the question, right, most Americans have wage and salary income, which is taxed at relatively high rates. That means if you're not born into inherited wealth and you have to work or earn for the money to invest, you get much less after tax. By contrast, if you're born into inherited wealth, or you have the social capital, or you're part of a big enough business operation to borrow at very cheap rates, borrowing is currently not including it in the tax base. There's a variety of deductions to make borrowed investment financing tax favorable, often making wasteful investments profitable to the taxpayers, ones that are harmful to the economy profitable after tax in the form of tax shelters. All of this makes it quite easy to pay comparatively little tax if you already have the wealth or capital or the social capital to borrow from parents, friends, or others. This makes it hard to catch up for anyone who wasn't born into those privileges, for small businesses that want to expand to compete for larger businesses. It's an uneven playing field, partially created by our tax system, and it should be addressed. Thank you.
It seems to me what you're telling Chair Warren and the committee is, and I asked about loopholes, but I think you've gone even further now to describe what I really call the fundamental flaws that underpin the two tax codes in America. If you're a nurse in Medford, Oregon this afternoon, and you treat COVID patients, you pay taxes with every single paycheck. If you're a billionaire in an affluent suburb somewhere, to a great extent, if you've got good accountants and good lawyers, you can pay what you want, when you want to, and often hardly anything at all. So it seems to me what you have helped us do, Professor, and we appreciate it, is describe not just the loopholes, but the inherited inequity baked into this notion that there are two tax codes in America. And I'd be interested in your assessment of that as well. So if you add it up, you've given the chair testimony about how part of the problem is the IRS is outgunned and out-resourced, and that's why I asked about this problem with respect to Credit Suisse and what happened with respect to whether they told the truth to the Justice Department. That's part of it. Then loopholes are part of it. Then there's a question of whether basically the underpinnings of the system are fundamentally unfair, and I'd be interested in your last assessment because your other two were very good on enforcement and loopholes. What's your assessment of the fact that this inequity is just baked into this two-tiered system?
That's absolutely correct, Senator. What do high-priced tax lawyers do? What do my friends in practice and what do I train my students to do? Find one way of saying this, or one of the things they do, is to find what might seem like a small loophole and figure out how to drive a giant truck through it. That's complicated, wasteful, excessive structures designed for tax planning. There's not a clear division between what you might call a loophole and a fundamental flaw of the tax system that generates these massive inequities. For all the reasons you said, Senator, both our business level corporate tax system and our personal tax system with respect to the ultra wealthy are fundamentally broken and in dire need of reform. It matters for so many different ways, so many different harms to the social fabric of our country and to the functioning of our economy.
Well, I want to apologize to the committee's other guests. This has been, I think, a very good panel, and I looked at the testimony. You have arrived at a particularly hectic time in the Senate. I want to apologize to our guests and thank Chair Warren again for putting together a very important hearing, and I look forward to following up on what you tell us. Thank you all.
Thank you, Senator Wyden. Senator Cassidy.
Professor Hoops, am I getting that correct, Professor?
Correct,
Hoops, gotcha, thank you. What a name for a guy from North Carolina. Just would expect it, man, just would expect it. I'd like your testimony. You point out that a lot of the problems that, say, Senator Wyden is referring to or Professor Gamage is referring to are holes punched in the bucket by Congress. I think I remember, and if I'm wrong, I apologize in advance, that Senator Wyden is a really big advocate for tax credits for EV. So I'm a billionaire and a millionaire and a multi-billionaire, and I go buy a Tesla, at least when they had credits, and I got a big tax credit to buy the EV. I always found it ironic the working people in my state are subsidizing the billionaire buying the Tesla, but that's their issue, not mine. But to your point, if a corporation or an individual buys tax credits related to the production of renewable energy, we're being told that because their tax burden decreases, that somehow it's a little immoral and we should be going after it. On the other hand, this is the sort of social behavior we're trying to incent people to invest in such things. It seems like we're talking out of both sides. Any thoughts on that, sir?
Well, I think this applies much more to just tax credits. I mean, the loophole, for example, that Senator Warren was talking about using
The so-called loophole, right?
The so-called loophole. I mean, the stock options, you're literally just compensating your employees, right? That's perfectly thing to deduct on your tax return. So use your loophole in ways that if you actually talked about the issue, nobody would have any issue with that at all, right? You're giving your employees compensation, and you should rightfully be able to deduct that. Likewise, if Congress wants to incent more EV vehicles or they want to incent clean energy, they're going to give a tax credit. And so we use this language that you don't actually talk about the specific tax issue because there's broad agreement on most of these tax issues. Instead, we call everything a loophole, completely don't discuss the real issues, and as a result, don't really make any progress. And I completely agree. We need to actually talk about issue by issue what these things actually are, whether they're justified, and eliminate them or not. And instead, we say everything's a loophole, it's all bad, we're just going to layer on this other layer of complicated taxes that are going to have their own sets of issues.
So in your testimony, it is not just your opinion, because you've got an opinion, you're a learned person, but if I remember correctly, your testimony in one of the footnotes quotes academic literature, that political rhetoric actually, now I can't find the dadgum loophole, I mean, the dadgum footnote, but that political rhetoric actually drives tax policy, and if somebody wishes to kind of stick it to another person, they just use the rhetoric, they heat it up, they use pejorative terms, and that which just might be the internal buildup not being taxed in that nurse in Medford, Oregon's internal buildup on her 401k suddenly becomes a loophole. Do I remember that it was you that had that reference?
Yes, I think often the way we talk about taxes, we have to generate a demand for either tax increases or tax cuts. I mean, certainly both sides of the aisle are not innocent of this.
Now, and what you also referred to Amazon? Somehow there was political pressure to change the way that Amazon reported. I tell you, you know I'm sensitive to that. We have incredible power in Congress to pressure people, to really put the screws on them. If they don't comply, by golly, you're not going to get whatever you're seeking. And that is just a little bit too authoritarian for me. Because frankly, I've seen how government can make incredibly bad decisions, keeping people in dependency when they themselves would prefer to live independently. So I'm very sensitive to that. And again, I apologize, I should have had it better, but I gather that there are accounting rules changed as a result of political pressure, and you put such political pressure on the FASB would likely intensify if we were to tax book income. Would you like to comment further on that besides that which I just read?
I mean, that's correct. I mean, it's not that the accounting rules changed because of pressure, it's that they have not been allowed to change. So this difference that Chair Warren mentioned between Amazon expensing stock options for tax purposes, but not for financial accounting purposes, that actually shouldn't be the case. The treatment should be similar in both cases, and the tax code actually gets it right. The reason why financial accounting, in the opinion of most experts, is actually incorrect in this issue is because every time the FASB has said, we need to correct this to recognize this compensation as an actual expense, the Congress has not allowed it and basically threatened to put the FASB out of business as a result. That to me is just exactly what would happen if we had a tax on book income. When the stakes get high and we're actually taxing that number, taxing book income as part of the tax base, if the FASB wanted to make consequential decisions to try to actually to reflect the economic value of the firm, as is their role, Congress would step in just as they have in the past and not allow that to happen. I mean, the very poster child for the real corporate profits tax is a result of Congress having essentially messed up the work of the FASB, and that would continue to happen even worse if we were to have a real corporate profits tax.
Got it. Political control of the economy. Senator Warren.
Thank you very much, Senator Cassidy. So I think a big part of making the tax system fair is about how the IRS enforces the tax laws that are already on the books. When a teacher gets ready to do her taxes, the school sends her a W-2 form, and they send the same thing to the IRS. She knows how much income to report, and the IRS knows how much income she's supposed to report. It's called third-party reporting. It keeps people honest because the IRS can spot it if somebody fudges the numbers on their return, but not so for the top 1%. Most of their income comes from business interests and capital gains that they receive when selling assets. There's no third-party reporting for these types of income, so the IRS counts on the richest taxpayers to follow the honor system. Professor Gamage, it sounds like we have two sets of rules here. Wages for teachers and bank tellers and construction workers are all automatically reported to the IRS, but for the wealthiest Americans, it's the honor system. So tell me, is the honor system working?
No, it's not working, Senator, and it should be fixed. The academic literature is clear that compliance is very high for income subject to information reporting, and especially when there's both information reporting and withholding, as there is for the vast majority of the income earned by ordinary Americans. By contrast, tax compliance is quite a bit lower, much lower, when there isn't information reporting or withholding, as is the case for much of the income earned by the ultra-wealthy. It's past time to fix this.
So this kind of underreporting by high-income taxpayers creates what we call a tax gap, taxes owed but not paid. As some folks referred to earlier, IRS Commissioner Reddy was here last week, and he estimated that the tax gap may now be as high as $1 trillion a year. That is about the same as the amount of all of the Social Security checks that were sent out last year. Now, the IRS tries to catch tax cheats by auditing tax returns, but the wealthy enjoy a different set of rules here, too. After a decade of politically motivated Republican budget cuts, the IRS enforcement budget is now nearly 25% smaller than it was in 2010, and the agency employs 30% fewer enforcement personnel. Professor Gamage, the Republican budget cuts hollowed out the IRS. So what has that meant for the IRS's ability to conduct audits and catch tax cheats?
Thank you, Senator. The IRS is simply outgunned when it comes to trying to catch and police the tax shenanigans of the ultra-wealthy and largest businesses, whether these be clearly illegal, what the tax gap is mostly measuring, whether these be legal but very aggressive, I mean, it's not caught, but the more important category may be the borderline category. It's very well known, for instance, among the highest priced tax layers, that if you set up a complicated enough flow-through, pass-through structure through which income is earned, the IRS won't have the resources to be able to audit and challenge and look through what happens in that flow-through structure. The idea is to try to make, among many of the high-priced tax lawyers, is to do this while staying just on the side of what's legal, but maybe crossing over it, although a fair amount of what goes on crosses that line into clearly illegal tax evasion. Regardless, the IRS just doesn't have the resources and competence to look through these excessively complicated structures. And I'll repeat again, this is economically wasteful. Lots of money and resources are being tied up in these excessively complicated structures for tax abusive reasons, tax planning reasons, whether legal or illegal. We can and should prevent this, both through tax reform and, importantly, through giving the IRS the resources it needs to operate as a tax police.
Yeah, and looking at the numbers on this, audit rates for people reporting more than $1 million in income have fallen by 70%, and for people reporting more than 10 million, it's fallen by nearly 80%. Audits of big corporations, those with more than $1 billion in assets, have fallen by more than half. It's just as you say, Professor Gamage, these are complicated audits to do, and when the budget gets cut, that's where the IRS has been cutting. While the IRS has turned its eyes away from the wealthy and from giant corporations, it has come down hardest on the people who are cheapest to audit. Very low income taxpayers who qualify for the Earned Income Tax Credit, or the EITC. In fact, if you are earning $25,000 in a rural community in the South, you are more likely to be audited than if you are a millionaire living in New York City. The most audited counties in the country are poor, rural, and predominantly African American. Ms. Strotter, Does it seem fair to you that the IRS has all the information it would need to double check your employees' incomes right there at the IRS's fingertips, but that the wealthy get to hide income and wouldn't likely face any consequences from that?
Senator Warren, it is absolutely unfair in so many levels to not have documentation to make sure that the wealthiest among Americans are paying their fair taxes is a disgrace. You know, the IRS knows what I should pay. You know, it was referenced that they received the W-2, they know how much income I have, they know what I should pay. And to sit in this hearing today and understand that the same rules do not apply to the wealthiest of Americans. One thing that Mr. Cassidy said that is correct is that the rich will do fine.
Yeah. Thank you very much. You know, I'm working with my colleagues, including Chair Wyden, on a bill that strengthens IRS enforcement. One of the features of this bill is the requirement to strengthen reporting so that the IRS can verify information on wealthy individuals' income. Another is to give the IRS more funding to audit millionaires, billionaires, and giant corporations. Stepped up enforcement against these big tax cheaters would give us as much as $1.8 trillion in new revenue over the next decade. The only people who stand to benefit from a weaker IRS are wealthy tax cheats. Fixing the IRS is about making sure that the government is fair and that we have the revenue we need to invest in a stronger future for all Americans. Senator Cassidy?
Senator Warren, in all due respect, using terms like tax cheaters seems to prove what Professor Hope said, that we use rhetoric in order to shade the argument. I'd also like to do a little bit of fact-checking. The cuts to the IRS begin under President Obama, 2012. I suppose Republicans can be blamed for a lot of things, wanting the American people to be independent, not dependent, that sort of thing. But the cuts for the IRS begin under President Obama, just to say that. Mr. Pomerleau, do I get that name right, Mr. Pomerleau?
Yes, Pomerleau, yes.
Pomerleau, I'm sorry. I'm having a tough time today. There does seem to be a little bit of a verbal sleight of hand taking place here. We speak about, we're conflating wealth and income. And so as a percent of their wealth, people are paying so little. Now, but reasonably speaking, if we go to a nurse not in Medford, Oregon, but say in Shreveport, Louisiana, and she's got a 401k with internal buildup, year by year, she's not paying taxes on that internal buildup. Indeed, the taxes are deferred. And so, now granted, those with great wealth have more of an advantage from this in absolute dollars because they have greater wealth. But I don't think we would conflate the fact that she's saving for her retirement with her income when it comes to taxes. Is any issues with how I'm analyzing that?
I think it somewhat comes down to different definitions of income and, you know, philosophically what the tax base should be at the end of the day. I think many proponents of the wealth tax feel that the income tax, which they define as the tax that should apply to people's consumption plus their change in net worth, doesn't do a sufficient enough job in raising revenue. So wealth tax is there to fill that gap. But yeah, you mentioned another important point here is that the current tax code actually on purpose in many ways has been shifted more from an income tax to a consumption tax. So there are provisions such as 401ks that have been put in place to reduce the tax burden on the return to wealth for middle income earners that are saving for retirement. And the idea there is that if you reduce that tax burden, people will be able to save for retirement and have enough to care for themselves in the future. But I think you're right that a lot of this at the end of the day is, well, we really want to tax income, and we're upset that people are earning income that may not go taxed for a number of reasons, and that the wealth tax is really a backstop to that, rather than really just being upset that wealth itself is not being taxed.
Mr. Hodge, there seems to be a lot of unfavorable contrasting us with countries like Switzerland, et cetera. My understanding, though, that our tax code is far more progressive than theirs, that the value-added tax inherently is regressive. If you have a 21% value add, every step of the value being added, you're getting another 21%. And I'm spending most of my disposable income upon consumables, furniture, et cetera, that ends up being quite regressive. And that indeed the U.S. has a far more progressive tax code than such countries like, well, pick your European country. Any thoughts on that?
The OECD has looked at this and found that the United States has one of the most progressive and redistributive income taxes of any industrialized country. In fact, they found that only Israel taxes their wealthy more and redistributes more through the tax system. We actually do more than any other country to try to help low-income people through the tax code, through things like the ITC and the refundable tax credits. And so the poor in America, according to the OECD, have the lowest income tax burden compared to the poor in any other country because of that.
Okay. I will, 30 seconds left. I know you have another set, and I'll save my last round for my next 5-minute block.
Thank you. And I love being fact-checked. So let's do a little fact-checking on this. You say that the tax cut started in 2012 and President Obama was in the White House, and you are right. But I think you might want to go back and look at who actually led the charge to cut the IRS's budget. And I think it was the Republicans, but I'll do this one for you. Either way, can we agree that those cuts to the IRS budget were a terrible idea, and that the IRS needs enough money to close this tax gap so that they are actually able to enforce the tax laws that are currently on the books? We're not even talking about putting more laws on the books. Just enforce the dang stuff that's out there.
I am totally for the IRS being able to enforce the laws given to it. Of course, in any budget, trade-offs have to be made. And so if folks decide to spend money here as opposed to the IRS, then that is something which is a priority that Congress made. I'm not sure I would blame Congress, though, for a budget which the president signed.
Well, fair enough. But let's just stick with what we want to do now, because the one thing that's very different about spending money with the IRS is that it actually brings in more revenue. And so the question is, how much more revenue? And I understand that you object to my calling people who don't pay the taxes that are legally owed tax cheats, but I don't know what else to call.
Can I reply to that? Because
of course you can.
Mr. Gamage tells us that indeed most folks are not paying taxes because of laws that Congress passed.
No, but that's not what the IRS commissioner was talking about last week.
Well, that's different what Mr. Gamage is saying.
What Mr. Gamage was saying is $1 trillion in taxes that were owed but not paid. People who owe taxes and don't pay them, to me, that's the definition.
Maybe we need Mr. Gamage to clear up my misimpression or your misimpression, because I had a sense that, as Professor Hope says, Congress has punched a hole in the bottom of the bucket. And whether it is EV tax credits, et cetera, but people with wealth are not paying taxes because of provisions that we placed. And I think I heard from Mr. Gamage that the amount that is legally avoided is far greater than the amount that is illegally avoided. But if I'm wrong, please correct me, Mr. Gamage.
No, I think that is what Professor Gamage said. The point is, let's just stop at least the part that is already legally owed and making sure that people are actually audited, especially wealthy people, and that they are audited more often than poor people, and that we collect the taxes that are owed. That's all I'm doing here.
What I don't know is if the poor people, or people like me, are audited because they just have a computer program that kind of runs through and says, here's a guy with a W-2 and not much else, so therefore, I do have some stocks, et cetera, but, you know, somehow relatively easy versus that which requires going out and looking at people's books. If you're saying turn off the computers so that we're not going to look at that which we can easily look at, that doesn't seem very wise.
No.
On the other hand, we certainly should treat all Americans fairly, no matter what their socioeconomic class.
Good, and I think that is the point. We want to make sure they have enough money to be able to go after the complicated tax schemes that the wealthy are able to use and the big corporations. So I just have a couple of questions I want to clean up as we do this. We've heard a lot today about my wealth tax, including about how it would help close revenue gaps and grow the middle class. We also heard some criticism, so I want to take the opportunity to get a few more things on the record. Let's get some clarity about how a wealth tax could be implemented. Professor Gamage, a few of your fellow panelists have argued that it would be too hard to implement a wealth tax because we're unable to value the assets of wealthy individuals. Do you agree with that?
Absolutely not. Now, any tax system is going to be imperfect. A wealth tax would not be perfect, but it would be not hard at all to design a wealth tax that would do dramatically better than the existing income tax, much better, as targeted to the ultra wealthy mega millionaires and billionaires, as the proposed wealth tax would do. Not the vast majority, the majority of wealth is held in the form of stock and other publicly traded assets that are easy to value. And along with tax professors Darian Shansky and Brian Galley and economist Emmanuel Saez and assistants from the Roosevelt Institute, I've been working on a model set of valuation and enforcement rules for wealth tax reforms based in part in the successful Swiss wealth tax experience. The proposed ultramillionaire wealth tax would give Treasury the authority to adopt our proposed rules, or perhaps to come up with something better. I'm extremely confident that the proposed ultramillionaire tax as implemented by Treasury would do much, much better than our existing income tax at measuring and valuing and enforcing wealth or the true economic resources of mega millionaires and billionaires.
So thank you, Professor Gamage. Let me just look at an example of that. Dr. Disney, how much of your wealth is in stock and other property like that?
Most of it.
Okay, and how much is in one-of-a-kind, hard-to-value Disney collectibles or other things that are hard to value?
Very little. It's in my experience, very rare for a wealthy person not to know exactly where all their money is and how much everything is worth.
You know, there are plenty of tools available to value the assets of the wealthy. They are constantly being valued in the private market and for insurance purposes. The IRS values these assets when the wealthy die. And if it's really true that there are some billionaires whose wealth is so immense that we don't even know how to start counting it, then that is the best argument I've heard all day for a wealth tax. I have another question I want to ask about. A few of the witnesses suggested that taxing book income, like my real corporate profits tax or President Biden's tax plan, would cause corporations to manipulate their financial statements and to try to find the same kind of loopholes they now do in the tax code. So, Professor Gamage, do you think that giant corporations would be willing to report lower book income so they could avoid paying a 7% real corporate profits tax?
You have to start by remembering that profits reported for financial accounting purposes, as I think every tax analyst agrees, are currently inflated. They're inflated because inflating them gives managers higher compensation in stock options, among other reasons, and drives up share prices. To the Real Corporate Profits Tax Act would deter these financial shenanigans, and that would be good. And reminder, the best research in the academic literature suggests 50% book tax conformity. We currently have 0%. The Real Corporate Profits Tax would move us to 25%, a significant step in the right direction.
Okay, so would it be a fair characterization to say that by applying a tax to a number that corporate executives want to have as high as possible, that a book income tax would serve as a backstop to the existing loopholes in the tax code?
Absolutely, yes.
Okay. Now, one last area I just want to hit, and then I'll give this back to Senator Cassidy. Some of our witnesses have suggested today that a wealth tax and a real corporate profits tax would reduce economic growth. Professor Gamage, we're back to you again. What kind of impact would these taxes have on our economy, in your judgment?
I think they would help the economy and especially help shared economic growth and prosperity and leveling a playing field. The big problem in our economy today, as our economic research finds, is not on the supply side, lack of resources seeking investment. Interest rates are historically low. There's massive funds seeking investment. It's on the actual investment happening in a variety of ways. These tax reforms would help with this by, on the public side, through greater public investment, but also by deterring some of the tax planning shenanigans, which make it so that instead of productive investment, what we see happening is excessively convoluted structures designed to minimize tax, some legal, most legal, but some illegal, but regardless, wasteful, economically harmful, and the overall tax reduction that the ultra-wealthy get away with and large businesses through these structures stands in the way of real economic growth and prosperity.
Well, these taxes would raise as much as $6 trillion that we can pour right back into communities and families all around this country. We can make serious investments in good jobs, in strong infrastructure, in quality child care for every family. Those are investments that help families get ahead. And when families have the support they need and the jobs that pay fair wages, they can spend a little more at their local businesses and maybe start a small business themselves. Senator Cassidy, why don't you ask whatever last questions you want to ask and make a closing statement? Then I'll ask my last question and do a closing statement, and we'll wrap this up.
So, Professor Gamage, Mr. Hodge quoted CEO as saying that
He's muted.
Mr. Gamage, Professor Gamage, Mr. Hodge made the statement that when the private sector invests, you get about a 10% return. And when the public sector invests, you get about a 5% return. But it seems as if you're favoring so-called public investment. I'm sure you would argue that, no, I want both. But I was just told 2 days ago that when the New York school system builds a building, it costs 50% more than when a private company would build the same building. And I have here an article, Why New York Will Never Build Another Subway. And they just talk about the incredible expense and delay of building their last few miles of subway in New York. Let's see, 1.5 mile subway costs $4.6 billion. I'm not sure I'm as confident as you that private sector investment will be as fruitful. Now, are you speaking not of construction projects, but of, paying for child care workers? And if that is the case, I didn't think that economists were quite as positive about such consumables, as one economist called it, leading to long-term economic growth as infrastructure. A lot there, I apologize. And I have to ask you to go quickly because I have a couple more questions in just a little bit of time.
Okay, I'll try to be quick. I'd say two things. One is the public and private sectors are better at different things. Each are important for a society with shared prosperity. Second, these tax measures being considered don't create this choice between public or private investment. It may have been the case in the 1950s and 1960s that a big problem with our economy was lack of capital stock. That has not been true for decades, and it doesn't appear that will be true for decades to come. What the problem in the economy right now is lack of overall investment. And these tax measures, I do not believe, would significantly or at all reduce private sector investment. In fact, I think they might switch currently wasteful tax stratagems and excessively convoluted structures into real investment as another way of helping the overall real economy.
So, Professor Hoops, you had mentioned in your testimony that you think it's far more difficult to estimate overall wealth than Professor Gamage seems to think. And I'd also, so please give your perspective on how easily that can be done. And secondly, do you also agree that these tax stratagems are diverting so much investment that could otherwise go well, that our society would be far better off?
So again, valuation is difficult, right? So it's difficult to value things, and that's actually the case of the kind of underlying root of another big tax planning problem we have in the United States. So several times already, people have mentioned profit shifting. The heart of the issue of profit shifting is not being able to value intangible assets and the return of those intangible assets back in the United States. If it were so easy to value these assets, then we essentially wouldn't have this profit shifting issue. Because we have in the profit shifting case that the system doesn't depend on realization, that'd be the exact same issue with a wealth tax. And so again, the valuation really is an issue you can't just simply wave off, because there are already pieces of our tax code that seem broken because of valuation. Now, to get to the private investment piece, I don't think that corporations are spending such massive amounts on tax lawyers and accountants as a producer of tax accountants. Maybe I wish that were the case, but I don't think they're actually hiring as many of them, that they're unable to invest in profitable investments because
It seems like that would be a very marginal cost relative to the overall operations on pick a corporation, Boeing or Google.
I mean, I don't have the numbers, but this is a noble fact. I mean, it's silly to talk around and sit around. So we have statistics on how much tax planning or how much corporations actually spend on this, and it's simply not that much money. To assert that it is simply not the case.
And this kind of, I agree with you, you said wave off the complexity of it. I'll finish before my opening statement with an anecdote, because sometimes the anecdote proves the rule. There's a gentleman back home, grew up poor in North Louisiana, started a construction firm, and now it is, I'm sure, I don't know how much the guy's worth, but he's worth a lot. Along the way, he has made a lot of people very wealthy, with profit sharing for his employees, so that if he did well, they did well. And not just as chief lieutenants, but people all the way down the line. Now, as I thought about, as this was going on, I thought about valuing his business year by year. One year, they may get $1 billion contract to do a massive public works contract. And then the next year, they may not. They're just doing this, and the value of it's depreciating. And then the next year, they may or may not. But then they may do really well, and then they may do really poorly. And a family-owned business would have to then really spend money on valuation with the potential for audits, because the value of the company presumably is fluctuating every year depending upon their book of business. And I can see doing it one time. I'm selling off the business. I'm turning it over to my kids, whatever you want to do. But on a year-by-year basis, that would be a degree of complexity that would require a higher marginal cost of tax planning. Mr. Hoops, I think your analysis just in the real world sounds better than Professor Gamage is more accurate. One more thing I'll say, obviously Dr. Disney's income is passive. In the case of this gentleman, his is active. And along the way, I've found multiple people in whom he's invested in their business. He never told me, they told me. And then they end up doing very well. So when you actually have to work your wealth, you create wealth for others. That's different, I suppose, from passive wealth. Let me finish with my closing remarks. I thank all the witnesses for a very informative meeting. We heard a great deal of promise about the benefits of new taxes, but I think our discussion highlights that there's no such thing as a tax that does not hit workers, consumers, and investment. Mr. Hodge, in his comment, put about there's a balance there between equity, between revenue for the government, and between investment. As we recover from the pandemic, businesses seek certainty and predictability so they can get back to normal. Congress should work to get the economy back to normal, back to the economy we enjoyed prior to COVID, which was done by lowering taxes, not by threatening to have higher taxes. Thanks again to Chair Warren, to all the witnesses today. I yield my time.
Thank you, Senator Cassidy. You know, we've talked a lot about tax reform today. Tax reform is just about choices. We can let our roads and bridges crumble, not upgrade broadband, make no investments in child care or getting lead out of drinking water, and let rich people keep paying taxes at about half the rate as everyone else. Or we can ask those at the very top to pay a wealth tax, We can require giant corporations to pay a tax on book profits. We can get serious about tax enforcement for the rich and powerful. Those 3 changes in the tax code would give us trillions more than we need in order to pay for President Biden's infrastructure plan and his care economy plan. It's all about choices. So let me ask you, Ms. Strotter, what kind of difference would it make to close these multi-million-dollar tax loopholes and instead invest that money in communities like yours?
I think if more members of Congress walk the streets as I do, as ordinary, and not to say that Congress is not ordinary, but to the lay people that are out here working day by day, paying taxes, this would make a tremendous difference in our communities, whether they are communities of color, communities that are rural, that might not be of color. When you think about the division between the haves and the have-nots, it is huge. To not pay taxes is something that should not occur. To hide your tax money should not occur. To have multiple levels of ways of paying and not paying taxes should not occur. So we need this in our community. We need the taxes to be equitable and equal among everyone.
So let me ask you, Ms. Strotter, what does it mean to you to pay taxes?
It means I'm doing my fair share. I went to school, my grandchildren go to school, so taxes are necessary. They're necessary for services. I don't want to say I enjoy paying taxes, but I understand why I pay taxes. It is a requirement of civilized society to take care of themselves and take care of others. So I pay my taxes. You know, if not on time, I get to my tax, but I pay my taxes.
Good for you. You know, the tax system has been tilted toward the wealthy and powerful for far too long, and America's families have paid the price. So let's unlock a brighter future for our nation by finally making this tax system work for working families. I want to say a very special thank you to Ranking Member Cassidy for his help on this committee hearing today. Thank you to our witnesses, every one of you, for being here today and for providing testimony. For senators who wish to submit questions for the record, those records are due 1 week from today on Tuesday, May 4th. For our witnesses, you have 45 days to respond to any questions, and thank you again for volunteering your time for being here. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.